I recently made a goal for myself. It's not a goal of any productive standard. And to cut to the chase, that goal is to watch 100 movies by the end of 2022. And by watching 100 movies, it means watching 100 movies for the first time, and that includes movies released in 2022 as well as movies released outside of 22. Just, 100 for the first time by the end of the year. I found this goal to be pretty attainable relatively early in the year before the halfway point. It was as early as April, but probably May, where I looked at the number of movies I watched for the first time this year and found that I could probably hit 100 by the end of December. So since I've actively embarked on accomplishing this goal, I stopped rewatching movies. Stop rewatch. If you remember in my comfort movies video, I said that I tend to rewatch movies on Sundays, just as a way to prepare myself for the upcoming week. Right? I haven't rewatched a movie since probably March latest, but likely February or even January, because I've been actively trying to accomplish the goal of watching 100 movies for the first time rather than rewatching them. And so that just got me thinking about rewatching movies. More specifically, I had made a short list, earlier this June, and it's a list of movies that I wanted to rewatch to form a different opinion of, optimistically for the better. So these are movies very well received. Movies such as Tokyo Story, um, Doctor Strangelove, and How I Fell in Love with the Atom Bomb, the Stanley Kubrick movie, right? These are movies that were very well received within the film community, but I didn't really get. You know, I would have to say out of the 7 movies I put on the list, I liked all of them, but I didn't really see the big appeal. You know what I mean? And why that, those were considered great movies. But I made the list because I wanted to be optimistic about changing my opinion on them. And so then that begs the question, when have I changed my opinion on movies? And that's the point of this video. I want to talk about times that I, in fact, have changed my opinion on movies for both the better or the worst, right? So I guess just to get right into it, I want to start with the movie that had the most drastic change, right? The biggest change. This was a movie that at first I thought was okay, and then it got on to become one of my favorites. That movie is The Big Lebowski, directed by the Coen brothers, starring Jeff Bridges and John Goodman, right? So when I first watched this movie, I was in the mood for a comedy, and not just any comedy. I wanted to, belly laugh. I wanted to bust my guts laughing, right? And I settled on The Big Lebowski. Some of my friends like the movie. One of my good friends, Ben, says that's his favorite movie of all time, along with his most watched movie. So I took that opinion pretty well, and I watched it, and I thought it was all right. I wasn't really that impressed, you know. Far from a bad movie, but when I finished with it, I was like, I don't see how this is considered one of the greatest comedies of all time, right? Same with Doctor Strangelove, right? Like that's considered one of the greatest comedies of all time. Um, but I didn't get the comedy. But back to The Big Lebowski, um, something about the movie wanted me to go back to it. Upon my first watch, my impressions were that the characters were really eccentric, right? And I thought Walter was really funny. That's about it. You know what I mean? I think that the beats and the plot weren't really that investing. Didn't really give me much payoff or catharsis, right? I came with that movie pretty underwhelmed, right? I didn't really get much from it. But after viewing it for the first time, I saw discourse and reviews for the movie, and it kind of reinforced some of those feelings in me that want to rewatch it. And it's that it was my first Coen Brothers movie, so the humor isn't really conventional, at least compared to what I have seen, especially compared to what I have seen. I liked, Parks and Rec as a comedy. I enjoyed, anime comedies, right? That's very different from the likes of the Coen Brothers. But I found that, at least for the Big Lebowski, the humor doesn't really have a punchline. There is no build up, and there is no climax, catharsis payoff, right? Of the joke, you know. It's through the characters that you find the comedy. It's through the dialogue. And like I said, not through in a way that's a punchline. So rewatching this was important was to look for something different. So I rewatched the movie, and my opinion became better. I found once looking for the humor in the characters that I would only describe at first as just eccentric became very memorable. After the third watch, they became from very memorable to very funny. You know, and The Big Lebowski has a lot of great quotes. It's a very heavily quoted movie. Quotes like, the rug really tied the room together. Just things like that you don't really get right away with first watch, right? Once you kind of know what to look for, especially with The Big Lebowski, the movie becomes extremely funny. It is one of my most quoted movies. It is arguably my favorite comedy of all time. It went from, like I said, a decent movie to one of my all-time favorites. So let's talk about a movie that did the opposite. That movie is Five Element Ninjas, right? Five Element Ninjas, after my initial first watch, I thought it was one of my favorite martial arts movies of all time, right? And this was because how I remembered it with my first watch was that it had so much action, right? I thought, at least how I remembered it upon first viewing, is that it would have a few minutes of dialogue and then 5 minutes of action. A few minutes of dialogue, 5 minutes of action throughout the entire 100-minute, 120-minute runtime, however long it was. I thought that it was literally like 50-50. Half the runtime was just for dialogue, and then half the runtime was for action. That's how I remembered it. And just seeing the talent of the Venom mob and choreographing, their numerous fight sequences, they're all very talented. They can create believable and investing fight set pieces, and they can do it a lot. They can have tons of fight set pieces, and they don't get stale. They don't get boring, right? And I had thought that Five Element Ninjas was just like overstuffed with action, right? And that it just had so much action that even if you're like a newcomer to martial arts movies, you can't be bored with it with all the action that's present, right? I watched it sometime in my late teens. Maybe I was 19 or 20 when I watched it for the first time. And then I watched it again a year later after my first watch at my cousin's house. And I found the movie to be a lot more mundane. And I don't know what about this rewatch sparked it, but it revealed that I probably remember the movie wrong. What I got out of my rewatch of Five Element Ninjas was that there was not nearly as much action as I thought there was. I'd went from thinking the movie was like 50% action and 50%, normal standard dialogue. There was really only one or two action fight scenes per act. I could probably count on one hand the number of fights, fight sequences outside of the introductory fight sequence as, all the credits show, right? In the beginning. And it's a big surprise to see a movie that you thought had all this content, right? And to see it only had like a fraction of it, right? To see a movie go from one of your favorites, instant favorites to just a decent movie. And it wasn't nostalgia because, like I said, I saw it in my teens and I rewatched it again only a year later, right? And I'm like, well, what made me think that it had more action than I thought it would? And I don't know. I can never know. But point is, that is definitely an example where I rewatched a movie, and I was disappointed in what I saw. I did not get what I got my second watch was so drastically different from what I got from my first watch that it reduced my regard of it. I'm thinking I could rewatch it one more time to see which stance is true. Did it have a lot of action, or did it just have a decent amount of action, or was it just like a throwaway Shaw Brothers movie? I mean, it did have a great set piece at the end, which Chang Chen movies always do, but that's besides the point. Let me go into the last movie that I want to talk about. When you go into film, right, and you want to expand your film taste, you want to go into the history of film, right? Important filmmakers. Martin Scorsese comes up, right? He's considered one of the most well-received and most important filmmakers of all time. And if you go into his filmography and you go into what's considered his best movies, you'll have movies like Taxi Driver, show up, Goodfellas, and what's often considered his best movie, Raging Bull, right? Considered his magnum opus, one of the greatest, not just one of the greatest sports movies of all time, not just one of the greatest boxing movies of all time, but one of the greatest movies of all time overall. And with that level of esteem coming from a filmmaker that you're under the impression is one of the best of all time, at least going into Scorsese's filmography for the first time, you might have some expectations for it. I had understood that Raging Bull wasn't a boxing movie in the sense that there wasn't like action set pieces to look for. If with me, a martial arts, movie fan of, I love fighting in movies, I understood that Raging Bull wasn't like Rocky or wasn't like Cinderella Man or wasn't like the final action set piece in Ip Man 2, right? I didn't think that it was known for having great action sequences. I knew there was something else to the movie, but I still couldn't help but be underwhelmed when I watched it for the first time. Even if I wasn't expecting it to be, you know, a violent, display of boxing, at least for the sake of entertainment. But from what I got from what was considered the greatest movies of all time was a super uninvesting hero. So Raging Bull stars Robert De Niro as Jake LaMotta. And Jake LaMotta is not a guy you want to root for, right? The movie is about how his jealousy, how his rage, his appetite, and his insecurities would eventually, tear him and his family apart, tear his boxing career apart, and his life apart, right? And you just can't root for this guy. You see, Robert De Niro as Jake LaMotta, waking up his wife in the middle of the night to ask her if she thinks of other men while they're in bed, right? Like waking her up to ask that question. That's ridiculous. Or like his wife would make a gesture at someone to say hello or a greeting, right? And he would just take it as infidelity, right? It's really hard to be invested in someone that insecure, you know, over very harmless stuff. And like I said, the movie's about how that jealousy tears, him and his family apart. The jealousy gets the better of him, and he takes it out on his friends and his family for the worst. And you see this guy slowly descend, into a worse and worse place. That movie's not really something you watch for entertainment, right? And I just couldn't help but come away from my first watch of Raging Bull and be like, I don't get it. I can't see how that's one of the greatest movies of all time, right? But not too long after my first watch, I thought about it. Something was driving me to go back to that movie. And I think it was this conclusion in my head. I knew what to look for now. I knew what the movie was about. I knew that it was about the descent to madness. The descent to, you know, self-destruction, right? And so I rewatched it again. Now, knowing what to look for, I knew what story wanted to be told, and so now I was looking to how it was told. And with my second watch through of Raging Bull, I was enamored, right? Because what's amazing about Raging Bull is how the story is told, right? We have the amazing craft of Martin Scorsese alongside the fantastic performance of Robert De Niro. Okay. So when I say that you can tell that Jake LaMotta, the character of Jake LaMotta, is jealous at his wife for, greeting other men, making gestures at them, harmless gestures, rather, there's no room for questions. And that's because of Scorsese's great direction and Robert De Niro's performance. So there's scenes where, Jake LaMotta's wife will go say hi to another man. You can tell by the way that by the way, there's nothing new that I can say about Raging Bull. This stuff that I'm saying right here is not new. This has been talked about for over 40 years now, right? So, but this is what I got out of it. I realized this with my second watch. So there'll be scenes with Jake's wife, right? And she'll be saying hi to another man. Okay. The way that the camera is situated on the scene as it watches um, Jake's wife, interact with other men, that doesn't feel right. The camera then cuts to Robert De Niro. And you can just tell by his eyes, the way that he looks at the scene, he looks at his wife doing whatever, his facial expressions, his body language, right? You know that there's jealousy brewing up inside him. And what's amazing about Raging Bull is that throughout the movie, you can see that slowly build and ultimately, climax into, the destruction of his career, right? And I think that craftsmanship was something that I didn't look out for the first time when I watched Raging Bull. But now that I knew the story, all the craftsmanship came through to me, and now it's one of my favorite Scorsese movies. It isn't my favorite, my all-time favorite. That's Mean Streets, surprisingly, but it is definitely a good example of me really liking a movie more after the second watch. It is a damn good movie, and I was open to that happening, to me liking it more, and it wasn't me just pretending, right? That I get it now, but it just kind of goes back to the Big Lebowski, knowing what to look for. So now what's next? You know, I'm thinking that since I've created the list of movies that I want to eventually rewatch to hopefully get the better opinion of, I hope to get 10 movies. Or maybe go with the 7 that I've already placed, right? Let's go over the movies. But my goal is to get, either the movies I have currently or 10 movies that I want to rewatch and hopefully get a better opinion of. And I hope to watch them all and then make a video about me ranking the movies or talking about if my opinion changed about them, right? So let's go over the movies. So first you have Rear Window by Alfred Hitchcock. That was a decent movie, and it was actually pretty compelling, but I think it was very boring in between, with all the wine swirling, whatever. That doesn't make sense if you haven't seen the movie. But point is, I think that there's spaces of mundaneness, but I want to like Rear Window better because I saw Rope by Alfred Hitchcock, and that was really really good. And Rear Window is often considered better than Rope, so I'm like, well, might have been something I missed for Rear Window. Tokyo Story. Tokyo Story I found pretty mundane as well. It's just to me, I found it as just characters just talking. In the Mood for Love, a romance movie that I didn't find have a lot of catharsis or payoff, but I want to pay attention to the storytelling, right, and how the story is told through the director and through the amazing talent on screen, right. Paprika, Inception by Christopher Nolan was heavily inspired by Paprika, but I like Inception more. I found Paprika boring, but I think with rewatches, kind of like Inception, you can kind of pick up the foreshadowing, right? Doctor Strangelove and how I learned to stop worrying about the love bomb. That's the full name. I didn't find it very funny. I'm thinking, if I knew more about history, would I find like the Cold War, or whatever? Would I find this movie funnier? I don't know. Indiana Jones and King of the Crystal Skull. I actually think this is a decent movie, but because I love the first three movies, I'm thinking, hey, this one isn't that bad. And last but not least, Tenet. Tenet is basically asking for a rewatch with how it sets up foreshadowing and such. But look forward to that movie, or not that movie, that video in the future, where I kind of go over these movies again and see if my opinions change. And I'll go into more detail about my opinion, but that'll be for the future, and look forward to that in the future if you're still here. And for those who still are, thank you very much for sticking with this channel. I appreciate it. I'll catch you later.